began as one of those rare, perfect mornings, the kind you almost don't notice because everything feels just right. The sun filtered softly through the kitchen blinds, the scent of fresh coffee drifted through the air, and the quiet hum of the neighborhood signaled the start of an ordinary day. Birds chattered in the oak tree by the porch, and the rhythmic ticking of the clock seemed almost comforting. My wife, still in her robe, was scanning through emails from the sheriff's office, half smiling at a message from one of her deputies. For a brief moment, everything was peaceful, predictable, and calm. That calm shattered in an instant. A pounding, hard, sharp, and deliberate echoed through the hallway. It wasn't the kind of knock you expect from a neighbor or a delivery driver, it was the kind that carries authority, or at least the illusion of it. Startled, I glanced through the window and froze. Two men in dark tactical uniforms stood on the porch, hands resting on their belts, eyes scanning the property like they were preparing for a raid. Across the street, a few neighbors peeked from behind curtains, drawn by the sudden commotion. I opened the door, heart thudding, and before I could speak, one of the men barked out, "We're here on behalf of the HOA. Compliance inspection." His tone was clipped, almost rehearsed, as if he'd practiced intimidation. Behind me, my wife appeared calm, composed, assessing the situation with the steady gaze of someone trained to handle threats far more serious than a pair of self-appointed enforcers. The men didn't know who they were dealing with, and I almost pitied them for it. What began as a quiet morning was about to spiral into a confrontation that would expose just how far this HOA was willing to go. The two men on our porch looked more like tactical officers than anything associated with a homeowners association. Their boots were polished to a military shine, their shirts bore stitched patches that read HOA Compliance Division, and the glint of metal at their hips confirmed my suspicion these men were armed. The absurdity of it almost made me laugh. Armed HOA officers? Since when did checking lawn heights or mailbox paint colors require sidearms? But there was nothing humorous about the way they squared their shoulders or the cold detachment in their eyes. They weren't here to chat about community rules, they were here to intimidate. Compliance inspection, one repeated, flashing what looked like an ID badge. It wasn't official, no county seal, no agency insignia, just the HOA logo printed on laminated plastic. I asked to see a warrant. He scoffed. "We don't need one," he said, trying to peer past me into the house. "This property has several reported violations." His partners circled the porch, taking photos with a tablet. That was the moment my patience began to evaporate. This wasn't procedure, it was harassment wrapped in a thin disguise of authority. Behind me, my wife's voice cut through the tension like a blade. "Step back from my door," she said, her tone steady, professional, and commanding. The men froze, startled by the voice of someone who clearly understood power and how to wield it. "You're trespassing," she continued. "Unless you have a lawful order signed by a judge, you're leaving this property now." The silence that followed was deafening. One of the men opened his mouth to respond, but the confidence in his voice faltered. The game had changed, and they knew it. What they thought would be a simple show of dominance was quickly unraveling before the eyes of half the neighborhood. From the start, something about their story didn't add up. Homeowners associations don't send armed men to perform inspections. They send letters, citations, or maybe a clipboard-wielding volunteer with a smile that hides irritation. But these men were different, military posture, earpieces tucked under their collars, and an unsettling silence between them. When questioned, they deflected, offering vague answers that raised more suspicion than reassurance. They kept referencing orders from the board, yet when I asked which board member had authorized their visit, they exchanged glances, as if realizing I wasn't as easily intimidated as they'd hoped. My wife, now fully in control of the encounter, stepped forward. Her badge real, official, and backed by the county hung visibly from her neck. "If you're conducting any form of inspection," she said evenly, "you'll provide identification, a written order, and a record of authority. Otherwise, this is an unlawful entry." Her words carried the quiet weight of someone who didn't bluff. The lead officer tried to maintain composure but stammered, claiming that the HOA had expanded powers under new community safety regulations. My wife's brow arched slightly. She knew that was nonsense, and so did they. The tension thickened as a few neighbors gathered at the edge of their driveways, phones out, filming. The supposed inspectors shifted uneasily. The presence of witnesses. And a law enforcement officer they hadn't expected was unraveling their carefully constructed facade. My wife pressed again for credentials, and finally, one of them relented, handing over a badge that looked like it had been printed at a copy shop. The moment she examined it, her tone shifted from measured patience to icy authority. "You're impersonating law enforcement," she said. "You need to step away now." The men froze, realizing their intimidation tactic had backfired spectacularly. The moment my wife's voice cut through the tension, the entire dynamic shifted. She wasn't just a homeowner defending her property, she was the county sheriff, off duty or not, and she carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had stared down far more dangerous individuals than these counterfeit officers. Her calm, deliberate movements contrasted sharply with their twitchy unease. She didn't shout, didn't threaten, she simply stood there. Unmoving, unshaken, and in absolute control. You could feel the air thicken with that unspoken truth. This wasn't their battleground anymore. One of the men, realizing too late who he was facing, tried to recover his footing. "Ma'am, we don't want trouble," he muttered, his earlier bravado replaced by unease. But my wife wasn't buying it. "You already brought trouble," she replied, her eyes narrowing just enough to convey the message that every word they said was now evidence. She stepped closer, enough for her badge to catch the morning light. "You're trespassing on private property, impersonating officers, and attempting to intimidate a law enforcement family. You want to tell me again who sent you?" For the first time, real fear flickered in their eyes. Their earlier confidence melted under her steady gaze. Across the street, neighbors were whispering, recording every second, and the realization that this encounter was now public only deepened their panic. My wife called for backup, not because she needed it, but because she knew procedure. Within minutes, a squad car was on its way. She instructed the men to remain where they were. They hesitated, glanced at each other, and I saw it the exact moment they realized the tables had turned. The inspection was over, and the enforcers had become the ones under investigation. The time the first sheriff's unit pulled into the cul-de-sac, the scene looked like something out of a police drama, only this was painfully real. The two so-called HOA officers stood frozen on our lawn, their faux authority crumbling under the weight of flashing lights and the curious eyes of nearly every neighbor on the block. Word had spread fast, people came out with coffee mugs and phones in hand, filming from driveways and porches. The quiet suburban street, usually filled with the hum of sprinklers and morning joggers, was now buzzing with tension and disbelief. My wife stepped aside as her deputies approached, their professionalism unmistakable. "Identify yourselves," one of them ordered, voice firm but controlled. The imposters hesitated. One fumbled for words, the other for a story that might sound believable, but there was no salvaging the situation. Their badges were fakes, their IDs inconsistent, and their explanation that they were authorized private contractors for HOA enforcement fell apart the moment the deputy asked for business licenses and contact information. None existed. As the truth began to unravel, the crowd murmured. Someone whispered, "I knew something was off with the HOA lately." Another neighbor nodded, recalling letters and threats that had started circulating months earlier. Warnings about mandatory compliance checks that most people ignored. But now those warnings looked more like intimidation tactics than official notices. My wife maintained composure throughout, letting her deputies handle the arrests while she documented everything. The imposters were read their rights and escorted to patrol cars, faces pale, their arrogance gone. The neighbors applauded softly, not out of mockery, but relief. The illusion of control the HOA had built was gone in an instant, and the neighborhood was seeing, for the first time, how deep the deception ran. What unfolded after that suburban standoff was more than just the exposure of two imposters, it was the unmasking of a far-reaching scheme that had quietly taken root in our community. When the deputies began digging into the so-called HOA compliance division, they found no record of its creation, no documentation in county filings, and no lawful authority backing its actions. Yet, hundreds of homeowners across nearby neighborhoods had received letters signed by the same division, threatening fines, property liens, and even security inspections. It wasn't just intimidation, it was organized extortion hiding behind the familiar face of neighborhood order. Over the next few days, investigators uncovered a web of deception. The two men who had shown up at our door were just the tip of the iceberg. Part of a private security company that had quietly partnered with rogue HOA board members. Their mission was to enforce bogus compliance violations and collect illegal fees from frightened homeowners. Some residents had already paid thousands, believing they were settling legitimate fines. Others had reported suspicious visits but didn't think anyone would believe them. Now, they had proof. As the evidence mounted, subpoenas went out. The sheriff's office, my wife's office, launched a full investigation across 3 counties. News crews descended on the neighborhood, their cameras capturing what had started as a quiet dispute but had evolved into a criminal case. HOA members scrambled to distance themselves, but the paper trail was relentless. The so-called compliance program had funneled money into shell accounts stretching across state lines. Neighbors who once stayed silent began to speak out, emboldened by the truth. What was meant to scare us into submission had done the opposite, it united the community. The HOA's mask of authority had cracked wide open, and what lay beneath was corruption, greed, and arrogance finally exposed to the light. What began as a confrontation on our front porch quickly spiraled into a story that reached far beyond our quiet suburban street. Within weeks, the investigation uncovered ties between several HOAs across 3 different states, all connected through the same management consulting firm that had been quietly buying influence in local boards. They'd convinced volunteers, ordinary neighbors, to sign off on programs they didn't fully understand, using legal jargon and fake compliance mandates to disguise their real goal, siphoning money from residents under the guise of community enforcement. The media coverage was relentless. Headlines read, "Fake HOA enforcement scheme exposed by sheriff's wife and neighborhood compliance crackdown turns criminal." Reporters camped outside the subdivision gates, eager for interviews, while state investigators pored over records linking multiple shell corporations and false contractors. It turned out the men who came to our door weren't just thugs for hire, they were part of a larger network designed to test how much power an HOA could seize before anyone questioned it. Our encounter had simply been the spark that lit the fuse. The fallout was swift. Arrests were made across several counties, assets were frozen, and legislative committees began reviewing HOA laws that had long operated in gray areas. Residents across the state demanded reform, and what started as our family's personal ordeal became the catalyst for something bigger, a push for transparency, accountability, and limits on unchecked authority in homeowners associations. Looking back, it still feels surreal how one morning's knock turned into a headline-grabbing scandal. But sometimes, it takes the right mix of courage, timing, and outrage to expose the truth. The HOA had sent its so-called cops to intimidate us, but instead, they exposed themselves to an entire nation watching closely.